I'm going to do just a brief introduction to the panel, and then we're going to run this a little differently because we've got 5 panelists here, so we thought if we each had them do statements, that wouldn't work so well. So we're going to do this as a kind of open conversation. So first, though, just to think about the problem. To make a democracy work, essentially, you need one of 2 things to be true. You either need a reasonably well-informed public, or you need a public that's willing to defer to reasonably well-informed elites. For most of American history, the latter was actually the case, which is why we could get by with a media system that was wildly partisan and insane most of the time. As the country democratized formally across the 19th century and then socially in the early 20th century, so that it was no longer the case that people were willing in quite the same way to defer to elites, we also had a change in the way media operated. And in the post-yellow journalism phase, really through most of the 20th century, we had a relatively centrist, moderate media. Now, what was interesting about that, though, it was also technologically structured, right? So that the organizations that were the producers of news were also its distributors. If you were an extremist and you tried to really reach a mass audience and you went, if I went to CBS or the New York Times in 1964 and said, I have this great story, Lyndon Johnson is running a child molestation ring out of a pizza parlor in DC, they would have shown me the door, right? Now, I would have had options. I could have published it myself, and an audience of 12 people might have seen it because technologically I wouldn't have had the resources to reach a large audience. There were some extremist outlets. I could have gone to the John Birch Society, which had a paper, or the Communist Party, which had a paper, and they might have been delighted to run my story. But it would have been seen by still a very small audience of the people who deliberately went out of their way to get that sort of stuff, which was not most Americans. The internet comes along, and of course, 2 things happen. One is the cost of actually producing a story like that and getting it out to reach large audience goes way down. And second, there's essentially increasing a break between the producers of news and the distributors of it, so that the distributors are no longer the producers, but really have become the platforms. So Google, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, Reddit, 4chan, I'm missing one big one, Facebook, are the organizations through which most people are getting their news. And they don't curate in the same way that the traditional media organizations did in their production functions. They would choose which stories to run or not use. That is no longer the case. And so the combination of those 2 things then has had an even further effect of inviting a lot more. And so the problems we've seen over the last few years, which run the gamut from true fake news like the child molestation ring out of the pizza parlor to all the way down to just what amounts to effectively propaganda, which is mild distortions of facts designed to get people really angry, all the way down to just heavily partisan news. That whole sort of ecosystem of media has been affected in ways, then that's what we really want to talk about. And in order to do that, we have actually a really spectacular panel here. I think there are bios in your materials, so I'm not going to go through the bios. But just very quickly, next to me is Mike Posner, who currently is the director at the NYU Stern School of Business of its Center for Business and Human Rights, and of course formerly was the US Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Labor. Next to him is Andrew McLaughlin, who is co-founder of Higher Ground Labs, but formerly was the US Deputy Chief Technology Officer in the Obama administration. Next to him is Juniper Downs, who is the global head of public policy and government relations at YouTube. And then next to her is Daphne Keller, who is the director of Intermediary Liability. That, by the way, that title needs to be changed.
Oh my God,
the director of studying intermediary liability as opposed to doing it at the Center for Internet and Society at the law school. And then finally at the end is Nick Pickles, who is a senior public policy manager at Twitter.
That's wrong.
That's wrong? Oh, that one's wrong. Yeah. Okay. Actually, everybody is a former legal director of products at Twitter. Okay, so I'm going to start with just a question to Andrew, which is essentially, how should we think about the role of these private sector organizations that have become responsible for news distribution and the flow of information? That is to say, do they have a responsibility to address the problem that transcends their business interests? And if so, what is it and why? And how do we think about that?
Yeah, so the short answer is yes. They do have a responsibility, and precisely because it is in their self-interest, precisely because it does not transcend their business interest. It's the heart of their business interest. So, here's like a way to think about it. So I got on the internet in '87, and then starting in '98, I was very deeply embedded in the technical coordination of the internet through something called ICANN, which I helped launch that year, and then I started a policy function for Google in 2000 and 2003, beginning of 2004. And so throughout that period, right up until when I joined Google, I was very much of the kind of optimistic early internet sort of ilk, believing that these open platforms and systems for information distribution, democratization, that democratize the power of creation and so forth, were going to be just an unvarnished good for the world and advance values of free speech and so forth. And in the decade and a little bit since then, my thinking has changed. In other words, initially my view was the best thing for the world is for the platforms to operate in whatever way they see fit, governments to stay out of the way, and to let the fundamental dynamics of the internet through its technical architecture and the market forces that seem to be accompanying it work their magic to provide everybody with a voice and new institutions of authority to emerge. And so that hasn't happened. And part of the reason I think that hasn't happened is because the platforms themselves are steeped in that same ethos, which they found it very difficult to shed as the limitations in their own products and services have become evident. And second, I think it's because I don't even know how to express this concisely, but second, I think it's because the openness of those systems has proven to be vulnerable to manipulation by people with malicious intent in ways that probably were predictable, but we didn't really fully anticipate. And so my view about this is not that government should regulate. I still think for all the reasons that were laid out in the last two panels, that's like a bad solution to the problem. But I very much think that the platforms need to step up and embrace a very different kind of responsibility than they have in the past. And so I would just, as an example of why that's so, I would just argue with one characterization that you made, which is I think that the platforms now are all fundamentally curatorial in their effect. And so what I mean by that is, we used to think about the internet in terms of these kind of open speech platforms, which I always think of as embodied by Blogger. So anybody can have a blog, anybody can follow anybody else's blog. You would type blog addresses in to your browser or bookmark them in order to go visit them, and you would read what people have written. And that was, of course, confusing, and so then we saw the rise of things like RSS readers, which would pull a bunch of blogs together and give you a feed. And then that kind of user interface has now become part of the heart of most of the big internet platforms, bolstered by an underlying social graph of individual connectivity that allows you to deploy into your product, the platform, to deploy into your product, an automated curatorial function that decides which of the many thousands of things you could see in a given day, which 20 or 30 you will see, or 60 or 100, depending on how heavily you use it. And so the old paradigm was this sort of duality of editorial publisher over here, who is fully responsible for the content of everything that goes on in the system, neutral pipe over here, which is just the telephone system that neutrally carries communications, and the old example we used to use to defend Google's search engine immunity was if two people use the telephone system to plan a crime, you don't indict the phone company. That's what Google is, effectively, a neutral pipe. The reality, though, is that these platforms are operating very much in the middle. So they are, in fact, selecting what their users will see. They're not editing content. They're not changing the words. They're not, using human judgment to decide what that mix should be. But instead, they're writing algorithms that use many, many different kinds of variables in order to decide which are the things that you could see, you will see. And so it's for that reason that I think in order for both the companies and their reputations to sort of survive this onslaught of attack from malicious actors, in order for them to be positive contributors to a society with rule of law and sturdy democratic institutions in which their businesses can actually thrive over the long term. And many other reasons besides, it's in their long-term interest to actually take responsibility for this hybrid role in between and actually make normative value judgments around things like journalism is better than propaganda. And so we will take steps to elevate journalistic news sources over propagandistic news sources. I think that is a defensible judgment for them to make as a platform, and to go and instantiate it and not simply say, we will just allow the social signals, the interest signals, the popularity and velocity signals to determine what people will see. Rather, we are going to engineer our system to vindicate normative values about which we can be transparent, even if we keep the underlying math hidden in order to keep it from being gamed. And so we will. And that's because it's not just like philanthropically good for society, but because we depend on good outcomes in that society for our future viability as a business.
So, anybody want to respond to that?
I mean, I'll jump in. I think we've spent a lot of time today talking about the problem and diagnosing the problem, and there's a lot of concern and anxiety that's been expressed, particularly about what happened in the 2016 election here in the United States. But I think the more interesting and the much harder part is figuring out what the solution is and looking at the costs that the various solutions might impose on the ecosystem as a whole. So I want to take a step back to, I think it was Timothy who opened the day by talking about the benefits that open platforms have created for society. And when you think about Google, our mission has been the same for a long time, which is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. So to do that, you have to have an organizing principle, right? Otherwise, it's pure information chaos. We couldn't possibly index the information available on the web and serve it up to users in a meaningful way without having some organizing principle. And the organizing principle that Google has always used is to focus on the user, to try to extract the most useful and relevant results for a particular query, to give people what they want to see, what they're looking for, right? And the reason that we've had that is, one, I would kind of pose to the audience and to the panel, what is a better organizing principle than that? Because I think it's a kind of a tough problem to puzzle through. But also, just as a pure matter of business interest, if we, all these platforms also are trying to retain users and create a product that people want to return to because they find it valuable. And so it's kind of a sensible business proposition as well to organize the world's information by trying to be responsive to what people are looking for, right? So I think what we've heard today boils the problem down into two kind of categories in terms of the role that platforms and the private sector play on these questions. One is really about algorithms, and I think this is what Andrew was talking about, is what signals go into these algorithms that we use to make decisions about what content surfaces on our products. And I'm happy to talk about that a little bit. There also are a lot of resources. I know there's been a lot of demand for transparency today. There are a lot of resources available. I mean, there's a whole website called How Search Works that gives quite a lot of detail, actually, about how search ranking works to respond to queries that people type into Google. We just hired, I don't know if folks saw this in the news today, Danny Sullivan, who used to run Search Engine Land, a publication about search, to be kind of a public liaison to build out more transparency around search, because we've certainly heard that interest. And the other question is there sometimes information that might be available on our services that's just too dangerous for people to see? Do we need to be removing more content from our services? And there hasn't been as much conversation about that today as I expected, but I'm happy to talk a little bit about what we do there as well. And then the third thing is, are we taking the the call to self-regulation seriously enough? So when I say the problem is easy to diagnose, I think there's a lot of things we can agree on pretty easily in this room, right? Credible news is better than misinformation. Interference, deception of users in order to interfere with their personal voting decisions, probably not a good thing for democracy, right? There are a lot of things we can agree on. But then how do we work from diagnosing those problems backward to solutions? And I think Facebook earlier, and Nick and I were just talking about this as well, the prospect of charging the private sector with determining veracity, as someone was talking about veracity versus virality earlier, while it sounds like a good idea, because who wouldn't prefer veracity over virality, what does that actually look like? Is the suggestion that for a platform like YouTube that has 400 hours of video uploaded every minute, and most of that content is perfectly benign, that we have editorial boards that are kind of reviewing all this content, what would that do to the ecosystem as a whole? There have been several people in the audience who have talked about the importance of these platforms for human rights activists, for people in repressive regimes who may not have very many speech rights prior to the rise of these platforms. So what costs will that impose on those actors in the system? And in order to solve a problem over here, because certainly there are problems and risks to the way these ecosystems function now, we have to be really cognizant of the effect that might have on the whole. So that's the word of caution I just want to put out there at the beginning of the panel.
So before others jump in, I'm surprised. We thought we all agreed on the problem, and I actually don't think we do, because I heard very different things here. So first, Andrew, you kind of assumed the problem away, I think, in your answer, but because the curatorial function that you suggested that they would exercise, which is, say, drawing the line between propaganda and good news, for instance, only aligns with their business interests if that's the way to maximize their profits. And I don't think that is actually the case by any stretch of the imagination. So the question is, and I don't know that we want to spend a whole lot of time fighting about that. So if it doesn't, because certainly I think they don't always perceive that it does. If it doesn't, the question was, do they have a responsibility? Nevertheless, by virtue of the function that they play. And before you answer, Daphne, your answer also kind of assumed the problem away.
Juniper.
I'm sorry, Juniper, right. Excuse me. Assumed the problem away in the sense that the whole problem is exactly that this speech is harmful and that technology prior to the internet prevented a problem from happening, but not because there was not exactly the kind of thing you've questioned going on. In fact, all the traditional producers of news were doing that. And we were not only content with it, but in fact, it's a big part of what made the system work. The problem exists precisely because we have lost that paternalistic curatorial function and handed it over to individuals. So the question, if that's the problem, it can't be an answer to say it's a hard problem to deal with. It is a hard problem, but that is exactly what the problem is, I think, and where the focus has to be. So I don't really, unless you disagree with that.
Well, so I'll fight back a little bit. I mean, so let's take the Facebook news feed algorithm, right? So the news feed experience. So I've got, I don't know, let's just say for even numbers, like I've got 1,000 friends on Facebook, and there's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of about 800 posts a day that I could see. And if I'm online a couple times a day scrolling through, I'll probably see 50. So that's a huge narrowing. So the idea that somehow tweaks...
No, absolutely. There's no question that they are curating. The question is whether...
That small tweaks will somehow flip Facebook from unprofitable to profitable or affect the amount of time that I want to go spend on the app daily. There is not a single linear objective combination of posts that is going to produce that business outcome. So I would argue on the one hand that, and by the way,
the question is just what are the criteria that they're using to do what curating they're doing.
That's right.
And it does not include content. And content is absolutely the problem here.
Yeah, but my argument though is that, and I guess I must have made it poorly. I'll try it again. My argument is that the company's long-term interest is in actively undertaking the mission to support and sustain democratic institutions, the rule of law, and so forth. In other words, not just measured by the quarterly results of the kind of like average, revenue per user, but rather taking a long-term interest in the health of the country in which, and the globe, but at least the country in which they're headquartered. That's my argument.
Okay. Let me give Juniper now. So what I put back to you was say more than again about what we can do, right, as opposed to how hard it is to do it.
No, I mean, you're right that I didn't pose a solution, but
What would it look like? How can we even think about it?
Yeah, I would love to hear from others on the panel on that. My intent was to frame the issue because I think that there's been a lot of focus on what's broken, and I think the rigor of thinking through potential solutions. So for example, if there was a signal built into the algorithm on Facebook or Google when someone is clearly entering a news query that is intended to measure veracity, right? What would that look like? What would the cost of that? What would the consequences of that be? And I just encourage, as we discuss the solutions, to have that framework around it, because I think people are focused on a very narrow problem without thinking about the overall ecosystem, the benefits that ecosystem is delivering to society. And I don't think that we should, tweak the way that the entire system works in order to solve a very specific problem without thinking through the collateral damage. That's it.
Fair enough. So other solutions, how to think about that?
So I'll take issue.
That's Daphne.
I'm Daphne. I'll take issue with Andrew too, just because it's fun.
Let's bring it.
I think it's very appealing to look at curation as a different function than being a neutral conduit or a neutral host, and to say that curation makes a platform have more responsibility for sort of bad content or bad prioritization that's coming over the pipes. And that is the approach that most legal systems take. In Europe under the e-commerce directive, or in the US under the DMCA, there is a line like that, where at some point, if you're too hands-on with the content and picking and choosing too much, you lose your immunity, and you're responsible if it's hate speech or if it's copyright infringement. But I think, Andrew, you talked about taking responsibility, and taking responsibility in a sense that's not about the law, that's about a set of values, sort of the values that the news broadcasters embodied in mid-20th century America in choosing what news we saw. And I think it's really hard to think about what responsibility does mean for a platform that is an open platform for everybody in the world to come talk about, their hamsters or their babies or their political organization or whatever they're talking about. And at this point, we have the platforms so very much constitute the public space and the place where we go to make our political statements, or the place where we go to have our business be found by customers, that I think a lot of people observe that the platforms function almost in this quasi-governmental way, that the place that used to be the public square, that used to be the sidewalk or the shopping mall or whatever, is now not owned by a township, not owned by the federal government. It's owned by Google or Facebook or whoever. And this enormous sort of state-like role that platforms have at this point is very hard to think through. Like, it's hard to think through what their obligations should be, given the scope of not just being the public sphere, of being where our tweets or our notes to our spouses about getting groceries go, to sort of our intimate lives as well. And there's a really dark scenario of what that state-like role looks like, which is states have restrictions on how much they can suppress speech because of the First Amendment or international human rights equivalents, but platforms don't. States have restrictions on the surveillance that they can conduct, but platforms don't have restrictions, mostly, on what they can collect and then hand over to the police when the police come knocking. And so there's this dystopian version of what the state-private relationship looks like, in which the platforms can effectively be proxies of government. A government that wants to suppress speech, or a government that wants to surveil people, can do it by getting private actors to carry that out. And that's, it sounds like something out of sci-fi. It's creepy. I have to say that the European Commission's communication on dangerous content online that came out the week before last looks an awful lot like that. It says that Google and Facebook and Twitter and every other host should have automated filters to monitor all the speech on the platform, detect if it's illegal, take it down if it's illegal, and then notify the police. It's sort of this amazing step forward toward this bad sci-fi future. And sort of on the flip side, if we think that platforms are state-like, maybe we want them to have state-like obligations. Maybe we want them to have a First Amendment obligation not to take down speech because they don't like breastfeeding images. But that gets horribly complicated also, as you know, in US law. So sort of to come back to your point, Andrew. I think it's fine to say, once the platforms are doing a certain amount of intervention, then they have new responsibilities. But that just moves you to the question of what the responsibilities are, and that's hard.
So what about, what about, and this is I think where I've become an Napa State from the old, religion, I used to accept the premise that it was a very slippery slope, that as soon as platforms started to make normative commitments about what's good and what's bad, then it becomes impossible to put the brakes on, and that you end up subjected to global demands from conflicting jurisdictions and evil governments and all sorts of other actors demanding that you accept their normative values as fundamental organizing principles for the content of the platform. So that's where I've become sort of an apostate, because the current situation has produced such garbage, such terrible results, like such rotten, kind of like evil culture, and all of the geopolitical implications that come along with the political consequences, the domestic political consequences. And so given that like, my Twitter experience is rife with, hate speech and trollery. I see in Facebook just like terrible echo chamber effects that make it very hard to talk with some people and easy to talk with others, and so forth. So anyway, bad situation right now. And so the question is, what would make it better? And one thing that would be great, for example, is if out of Europe somebody built an awesome social platform that operated in a very different way according to European values. That would be great. Actually, it would be fantastic, and it still irritates me that that has not happened, because that would be one way to build an alternate center of gravity operating according to alternate, rules and principles that people might find appealing, and would give a competitive pressure on the other ones to behave better. But all I'll say is, I now believe that because the situation is so bad, and the sort of net effect of these platforms, which I love and use every day, and just to be very clear, like everybody that works at them, Juniper, are like good people that I really respect, and I like have empathy for, the struggle to try to figure out how to make this better within the constraints that have been laid down by earlier generations, that had a sort of, I think, an unrealistic set of expectations. But anyway, it is now important, it's not just possible, but important for those platforms to say journalism is better than propaganda. And so the next recommended video on YouTube is more likely to be journalistic and less likely to be propagandistic, because we're going to make some judgments and bake that into the recommendation algorithm. The homepage trending videos, we will tend to elevate. And by the way, nobody's talking about deleting, nobody's talking about blocking. I'm talking about the functions of the platforms that direct attention.
Mike.
A couple of things. I just preface. When I worked in the State Department, I ran an Internet Freedom Initiative. We gave speeches about an open platform. I still support very much and recognize the value of what all the companies, the platforms are doing, and want to reinforce their concern that government intervention to dictate content is a dangerous thing. What the Germans have done with hate speech is not a good thing. But I want to go to something that Tim Gartnash said this morning. He distinguished between misinformation and disinformation. So we need to unpack this discussion. If you're talking about people, benefiting financially, involved in crime, whatever, to provide misinformation, that's one thing. I think we need to talk about disinformation, and I want us to focus on ISIS and the Russians. These are institutions or entities that are actively trying to undermine our democratic system. And for companies to say, and Juniper says, we're going to give the customer what they want, but there should have been a parentheses around that, except when the law says we shouldn't do it. Child pornography, promoting, violent extremism explicitly, violent acts. Companies follow what the law prescribes, but they don't affirmatively say there's some conduct by institutions like the Russian government or ISIS that we have to have a comprehensive policy we've got to react to. One other thing on that. Companies say, and somebody said it this morning, we're not arbiters of the truth. We're not editors of the New York Times. Nobody expects you to be editors of the New York Times. But the editors of the New York Times perform 4 functions. They decide what stories are going to get in the paper. They then edit the stories for content. They figure out where to place those stories. And then they figure out whether there needs to be a juxtaposition. Nobody's suggesting, I'm certainly not suggesting, that you edit the content or even decide what goes up there. But to say that that you're plumbers and that whatever gets up there, whatever people want is going forward, makes too simple what really is a range of things that Andrew's talking about. Where do you place something? If a Google search puts things to the top that the Pope endorsed Trump, there's something wrong with that search engine. If a Facebook page or a Facebook account, again, is looking at 400 different accounts or 400 different placements and only giving you 50, and one of those says that Obama was was not born in the United States, there needs to be a way to make a evaluative judgment when we're dealing with disinformation. ISIS and Russia are different than everything else. And what I would like to see is for the companies to say, we acknowledge that's a problem. We are taking an affirmative approach to that. We are going to go within our system and find out every way the Russians are involved, both in content and in advertising. We're going to take a range of steps. We're going to tell you what we're doing. I have not heard a single company say that about the Russian, and we're not just talking about the 2016 election. We're talking about a massive problem to our democracy.
Just very quickly, you're not suggesting, though, that the problem is limited to Russia or ISIS, and especially, by the way, once they're shown to be successful, you can be guaranteed that 1 million domestic people are going to start doing the same thing, precisely because it's effective, and they have the same interests.
You know,
Not the same interests as ISIS, perhaps, but the same interests in a partisan way about undermining people on the other side.
I'm not saying that, but I think it's important, when you have big, complicated problems, it's important to unpack them. And it's important to start with things that are very obvious. Mike McFall talked this morning about what RT and Sputnik are doing. We have a sovereign state that is trying effectively to undermine our democracy. That's a different thing than a couple of kids in Macedonia trying to make a buck.
For the moment.
For the moment. But let's start with that we know is a problem. We've got a problem with ISIS. We've got a problem with Russia. The burden is now on the companies to say, here's our strategy individually. Here's what we know about these things and how they're affecting our system. And here's some things we can do collectively. And we're going to present an alternative that's going to allow governments to step back and not interfere in this space.
Let me give Nick a chance, because he's been sitting patiently.
The challenge of spending 11 hours on a plane and then watching 2 amazing panels and then listening to these esteemed people, it's very difficult to know where to start. And I think the one thing that we can all say is everybody needs to do better. And everybody needs to do more. And the information ecosystem is much, much bigger than companies. It's traditional media companies, it's local news, it's all of us as citizens, it's political figures, it's think tanks. Everybody that's part of that democratic fabric in not just the United States, but countries around the world needs to do better. Because I think in the 2 cases that we've just heard there, everybody has been found on the back foot. And I think one of the challenges and the difference between Russia and ISIS want attribution. They want you to know. They want that message there. And actually, with specific regard to that, four of the biggest companies have come together. We established the Global Internet Forum on Counterterrorism specifically for that reason, to share knowledge not just across our companies, but because, and I think here's the challenge in this space, when we push people off our platforms, they go somewhere else. And actually, the danger is that you get lots of small chambers, and in those places, there's no counter speech. There's no one challenging. I hate that phrase, but Laura, I can discuss that at length later. There's no one providing an alternative viewpoint. So the echo chamber effect gets worse by moving people into smaller platforms. But we have to help those smaller platforms get those actors off their platform. Now, the flip side of that is when people don't want attribution, or they're motivated by money. I think 85% of the world's email traffic is still regarded as spam. That's after several decades of the entire internet industry trying to stop this problem. And it's still massive. And so it's hard. But one thing that is happening, and bots have been discussed, and if you haven't read the blog post that we published last week talking about the number of bots we're taking down, the number of spam accounts, I'd highly recommend it. In the past year, we've doubled the amount of accounts we take down for that sort of behavior. It's about 3.2 million accounts every week. But actually what's happening is behavior is changing. The adversaries in a whole range of different areas change their behavior. So it's not just as simple as saying, let's get lots of retweets now. It's having NGOs that they fund. It's having commentators who appear in traditional media, who have financial relationships or other relationships. It's people who, NATO used the phrase useful idiots. It's people who are actually sharing messages without realizing that they're doing that damage. And so one of the challenges that I think comes out of this work and the policy incubator, hugely grateful for the invitation to appear, has an opportunity. I don't think we've spoken enough about public diplomacy in the past 20 or 30 years. If we're talking about values, we're talking about liberal democratic institutions, the loudest voice in the room needs to be liberal democratic governments. And they need to be having a word in that battle of ideas that's happening. We can take content off our platforms, but we're not the credible voice to share those values. We need people on our platforms doing that. And it comes back to the biggest challenge, which I think we've talked about. If someone sees content that is propaganda, you can just show them some alternative content, and somehow that fixes the problem. And I think one of the biggest challenges right now is that you can show someone who watches one media brand a different media brand that's more balanced all day. They don't trust that. They don't see it as credible. They're not engaging with it. And how we understand that problem is at the heart of how we get back to this democratic institutions being viewed with confidence.
Daphne, did you want to?
Juniper. I'm flattered. Actually.
Both answers.
I have great respect for Daphne, so I'm flattered.
Just call me Peter.
Were you going to talk?
I was going to clarify some things about what we do and don't do, since I didn't do that when I laid out my initial remarks. And I think both Andrew and Mike will be happy to hear, because you address some of these issues. So first of all, on platforms like YouTube, we do much more than just remove things that are in violation of the law. When we receive notice that something may violate the law, obviously we do generally block that content for the relevant jurisdiction. But even though we're a platform dedicated to access to information and freedom of expression, we've long had community guidelines that set the rules of the road for what we don't allow. And those guidelines go above and beyond what the law prohibits. So we have policies around hate speech and terrorist recruitment and violent propaganda and violent extremism. I think in a single year we took down 92 million videos for violation of these policies. So it's a very active show of responsibility of us saying, yes, we have these values, but we also recognize that certain content just crosses the line and isn't part of the ecosystem we want to create, knowing that people come to YouTube to watch videos. It's an ecosystem where we are recommending new content to people all of the time. And so there are limits, and those limits are staked out to be more aggressive than where legal limits have been drawn in many, many cases. The second thing is, you talked about, if someone's looking for information, don't we want credible news and not propaganda? And we do that as well. I mean, when you see people looking for news on Google, on YouTube, we make best effort to show authoritative sources, right? Not misinformation. And when you think about the premise I said at the beginning of showing people the most useful and relevant results, if you think about relevancy has a lot of things baked into it in terms of the signals that we've developed over time. So, to be considered authoritative and a relevant source of information, we look at various things. I'm sure many of you have studied the original PageRank, where how many times is something cited across the web as one measure of its authoritativeness and its credibility, and so on. And obviously those algorithms have grown more sophisticated over time, but it's not just popularity wins, right? Like, we're looking at the information in our ecosystem and trying to serve up information that's a value, that's credible, because the trust our users have in our services depends on that. So all those things are baked into our system. It doesn't, of course, mean that there aren't things we could do better, but I wanted to just unpack some of those things a bit more. As Nick said, in addition to the Global Internet Forum to Combat Terrorism, which is the hardest thing to say, doesn't lend itself to a good acronym either, the industry has been working on self-regulation for the past several years, often in conjunction with government and civil society. So even prior to that, we had the Hate Speech Code of Conduct that we entered into with the European European Commission back in 2015, where we voluntarily submitted ourselves to certain commitments, including removing illegal hate speech within 24 hours and so on. Very similar, actually, to what the German law has put into law, but we did voluntarily commit to it EU-wide. And we get monitored and audited to ensure our compliance with that every 6 months. And so there is more and more of that self-regulation that's institutionalized across the industry. For those of you who want to see more of it, happy to talk about other forums where that may be appropriate. But certainly in terrorism and hate speech, several of those things are already in place and active.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? In the early 2000s, when Yahoo was called before a congressional committee after it had given the name of a user to the Chinese government, he was thrown in jail. They instituted a human rights program that included country human rights analysis or risk analysis, for example, when they went into Vietnam. Does Google or any of or Twitter have a Russia strategy and a Russia risk analysis? How are you going about doing it? And what are the results of that? Don't all answer once.
Nicole and I built a whole shelf of country-by-country binders,
Yeah.
right? So literally every country, we would unpack the law, the practice on the ground, the kind of the great axes for us at the time were censorship and surveillance, right? So free speech and censorship and privacy and surveillance. And then it grew to include kind of like everything else that you can imagine, intellectual property issues and tax issues and the price of electricity for data centers and all that kind of stuff. But we had these country-by-country binders that represented our best effort at a risk analysis.
But I'd be interested in 2017. What's the Russia risk analysis look like for Google or for Twitter or for Facebook if you're still around? And what are you doing about it?
Well, and actually, I'd say, zoom out a little bit. One of the reasons we publish transparency reports is because we're very acutely aware of those questions. And I think one of the challenges for this wider area is how can we be more transparent about what we're doing? So in the case of every country, we publish how many times are we asked for user data, how many times we provide it, how many times we receive removal requests, how many times we comply. There are legitimate user requests that come from around the world to investigate crimes. There are legitimate requests to remove content that violate our terms of service. And I don't have the stats off the top of my head, but you can search for it, or I think it's twitter.transparency.com /transparency. It's one of the two. Because we publish that data because we want whether it's Turkey, whether it's Russia, whether it's the UK, France, Germany, we do want the public debate to be informed. And actually, I think one of the challenges is that the transparency comes actually in that case all from the companies. And I think institutions like Freedom House try and do really essential work to build out that bigger picture. But again, that's where there is a role. We're working right now on MLAT reform. There is a role of governments around the world as well in setting those frameworks up.
So I think it's a problem, though, to conflate Russia and ISIS. I think they're extremely different problems.
They are.
And the ISIS issue has been front and center for companies and governments and media for years. And for that, I think I would challenge the idea that the companies always need to do more. There's been this pressure to do more, and about every 6 months, the companies announce they're doing something that's called more, and it's agreeing to a code of conduct to take down lawful speech. It's agreeing to share a database of hashes to identify videos that are themselves potentially lawful and maybe used in a lawful there are potential downsides to all of this, and my concern is that we know from research, mostly in the US, but also elsewhere, that when companies face legal liability, damages or somebody going to jail for not taking down users' speech, they take down a lot of users' speech. They err on the side of taking things down that are legal but controversial. And so every time this pressure on terrorist content gets ratcheted up, there is more and more reason to do that, whether for fear of a $50 million fine in Germany or for fear of terrible political consequences or PR consequences. And one of the groups that bears the brunt of that is Arabic-speaking social media users and social media users who are talking about Islam, and researchers like the Human Rights Database tracking Syrian atrocities, whose videos got taken down accidentally. You know, there's a very predictable spillover effect that hits a very predictable set of people. And this kind of gets back to what I was saying before about the government and First Amendment responsibilities. If government pressure is leading private actors to silence lawful speech in an entirely predictable way, is there some legal framework that addresses that? Is there some grounds to push back?
So I want to challenge all four. It's an interesting thing to me, I should say. Like, there's clearly uniform agreement here that the government regulation is bad, that any overregulation is a nightmare and awful. And I find it interesting in the sense that, because I think it rests on a really quick dismissal of the costs of where we're heading now. So I would say two things. One is, I would say we are on a path to the end of democracy. Right? I mean, we're at the beginning of it. It's happening with careening speed, and this is a huge part of that problem. So the protection of free speech under 20th century norms in new technology frameworks is ending democracy globally and in the United States. And the question, you know, all rights rest on both explicit and implicit policy balances. The explicit ones are the ones that we talk about in our law cases. But there's an implicit cost-benefit analysis which we take for granted because it's the world as we're familiar with it. So, you know, my favorite example, in 19th century, you have tort law that has all these doctrines that actually rest on the fact that accidents are few and far between. The Industrial Revolution comes along and they don't just take the same rationales and apply them, they have to rethink all the fundamentals. And we're in the same place on speech. These 20th century doctrines we could indulge because the reality of it was there was a massive amount of paternalism built into the speech framework. And if that's gone, and we say, but we're going to hold that 20th century norm that any government intrusion here, the slippery slope is so dangerous that we're better off not doing it at all, we might as well just end this experiment now. So if that's wrong, you have to tell me why it's wrong. I haven't heard anything yet.
Well, wait, is your point that we change the First Amendment or that we leave it intact but hold companies to a different standard? Honestly,
I think both. I think at the very beginning, we're not talking about the First Amendment because these are all private companies that use First Amendment norms as their benchmark. So the better analogy is they're all big newsstands making choice to let everything in the world be sold in their newsstand. And a traditional newsstand seller would say, you know what, I'm not going to sell pornography. I'm not going to sell the John Birch. So they would make choices. And there's no reason these people can't. It doesn't shut off the speech of anybody else. They can do what my 1964 guy could do, self-publish or go find some extremist who wants to do it. But by making themselves the routes to do it, they are exposing everybody to information that they don't necessarily go out and seek or wouldn't otherwise with consequences. But then, yes, I think ultimately we may need to rethink our free speech norms as we have rethought all of our constitutional norms when the fundamental technology that underlay the earlier understanding shifted. We've rethought our Fourth Amendment norms. I mean, you can go through, and we're just at the beginning here, so I think, and Jeff Stone, who was my con law teacher, was going to kill me to hear me say this, right? And I'm kind of shocked myself because I think of myself as a very traditional, very pro-free speech person, but I'm looking at this and thinking, you know, this is fiddling while Rome is burning, and if it's not government regulation, I need something more dramatic.
But so, you know, I was just talking to Jeff Stone a couple weeks
Don't
ago.
tell him
I'm going to tell him everything you just said.
He's not watching, I'm sure. Hey, Jeff.
But one of the things, because I was actually, he was also my First Amendment professor, and you were my professor, my Civ Pro professor. I don't know if you remember that.
I probably didn't get your name right then either. I had a seating chart at least.
I was more memorable then.
Daphne Downs.
But one thing he reminded me that I've been thinking about a lot in terms of these questions of what responsibility we have is that the First Amendment is not founded, and I think this is like a common misconception, the First Amendment is not founded on the idea that there's no bad speech. It's founded on the idea that there's no good rulemaker. Right?
Right, but I'm saying is we can indulge that idea when technology actually made it so that the bad speech really didn't.
But how do you solve for the no good rulemaker problem? Like if you expect.
Okay, but it's like that Rush line that, like, you know, not to make a choice is making a choice, or whatever. Geddy Lee sings it better than that. If you choose not to decide, you still. It's a really convoluted. It's like classic Rush. It's like 7 words too long for what is a short thing. But here's but this is the thing, right? So we have long been suspicious that people in political power can be trusted with the ability to control in any meaningful way the speech that happens in the country. Right? They have too much of an interest in suppressing opposition and dissident speech, so we don't trust them to make that decision. But we now live in a world where the controllers of those speech are these platforms, and to be critical, to be clear about what I'm saying here is the platforms are directing attention in a way which is not controlling speech. It is consistent with being an open platform, but because of the vast ocean of cacophonous contending demands on your attention to be good companies and to deliver good services for the users, they narrow it down and they try to give them a good experience out of all of that. It is that act which now places them in this critical linchpin kind of like position in society to either advance democracy or not. So where I am with you is like, absolutely, somebody's got to make sure that these platforms do it. I would love it if they would see it in their own self-interest and go accept that responsibility, architect their systems so that better stuff goes up. And of course I bristle a little bit at the idea that this is paternalism, but anyway, I guess maybe I should just own that and say, like, it's a little bit like, your example of the racist trying to get a letter into the newspaper. I actually think the country was better off when the editor of the newspaper was choosing not to run the letter from the KKK, Grand Dragon. So I want the companies to continue to be completely open, and I want them to be immune from government pressure to architect their systems to vindicate self-interested governmental objectives. But I also want them to recognize that the future of democracy depends upon them getting right this thing. And so, like, all of the things that you laid out, that Google and YouTube and Twitter and so forth are doing, they're all true. Like, the companies are doing a lot to try to step up. But literally yesterday, the top Google News story about the identity or the motives of the shooter in Las Vegas was a 4chan conspiracy thing, right? It's because the tech companies, and I totally understand where this comes from, with an engineering mentality, say we don't like making normative judgments, we're not good at it, it's a slippery slope, and so we're going to come up with proxies. So the relevance standard for Google search is super valuable, it's important, but it rests upon, these days it's quite complicated, but originally, to oversimplify, rested upon the link structure of the internet, essentially every link constituting a vote as to the authoritativeness of the source, not the popularity, but the authority. And then you would elevate more authoritative search rankings as a proxy for the value judgment that I would want them to make. My point now is we've got to move beyond those proxies because the algorithmic proxies, the structural mathematical proxies, are so easily gamed by malignant actors. And that's the world we live in now, is where we now have to deal with state actors, non-state actors, trying to game these systems in order to advance their goals, and the companies have to much more aggressively act against them, and by making value judgments.
But this is Daphne's point that she made earlier. First of all, just one fact correction on the 4chan thing. That is not Google working as intended. I mean, that did surface, that's correct, but it was corrected within several hours and replaced with more authoritative news stories about Las Vegas. So just want to be clear that that is not, yes, the system makes mistakes. We will be the first to acknowledge that, but it was corrected very quickly. But I think when you say, okay, the First Amendment, it's because the government's incentives will always be to suppress political dissent and maintain the status quo. What do you think the company's incentives are? Because the point Daphne made earlier is that what you see happening in practice is that there's a lot of pressure, downward pressure from governments that is actually having a huge influence over the decisions that companies make right now. So it's not actually divorced from the concerns that underpin the First Amendment, right? That is where the pressure is coming from. That's where the most palpable pressure is coming from, not from consumers, but from governments.
And I think that goes back to Larry's point. I think we're in a race against time here, actually. I think what the Germans have done with hate speech is now going to be replicated by what the British are going to do with extremist content. And then God knows what the US is going to do. And the Russians for sure have their own approach to this. We're going to wind up with a halal internet where every government gets to decide what's reasonable content. The reason I push back so hard against that, I think that's a disaster for the internet as a whole, and it's a disaster for our democracy. So the alternative is, then how does it get done? And I don't think the companies at this point are anywhere close to saying, we know we have a responsibility, and again, especially for disinformation. Daphne, you're right, there's a big difference between ISIS and Russia. I still haven't heard what the plan is for dealing with Russia. And every time I have the discussion, somebody in an internet company says, we're not arbiters of the truth. That's not the answer. It's really not the answer. There has to be an affirmative strategy, and the companies have to be clear, forthcoming, aggressive, collective, collaborative, and they've got to say, we've got this, we don't have it under control. We're never going to get it under control, but we have a strategy for this, and we're going to tell the whole world, this is partly our responsibility. Disinformation is different than misinformation.
And then Daphne, then Nick, and then we'll go to questions.
But so going back to a point that Nicole made on the other panel, I think the reason you're unsatisfied with the answers you're getting about Russia is because the first 8 months of the Russia conversation was about fake news that individuals or bots posing as individuals or whatever share in their news feed. And so there was a whole response to that, which was about third-party labeling and so forth, and it did or didn't work, but the response of we shouldn't be the arbiter of truth kind of makes sense for that. Now, the Russia story has changed. It's about a different product. It's about paid placed ads. And I don't think there's been a very good response to that yet, but I also think it's just new and everybody's freaked out and hasn't thought it through. I think that in a way, some things about that are easier because we already regulate campaign ads or election ads. The companies already have stricter policies for what can be in an ad than for what you or I can share with our moms. So I think that shifting to this newer problem that's about ad placement, it's important to distinguish that that's a new problem and to think about the different tools that we have to solve it. And this is actually, so I'm a little bit of is it apostate? I thought it was apostate. Anyhow, I'm a little bit of that too, because I'm usually the one saying, oh, companies can suppress lawful speech and isn't that a problem? But here, I kind of like this idea that maybe in campaign finance, like they could enact McCain-Feingold. The companies could enforce rules about campaign ads that the government could not enforce. And because of my personal values, I like that idea.
This isn't just about the 2016 election.
Yeah.
It's a much broader question of how do you deal with a foreign state that has resources that's coming after our democracy, and not only ours, but others.
Let's give Nick a shot, and then I just want to get people in the audience a shot.
No, and actually, the point is always that it's easy to look at one problem, but there's different manifestations of the same problem in different places. So bots, which we talked about earlier on, we were seeing those in Mexico going after journalists. Those who were here a few weeks ago will have heard from Rappler in the Philippines and the way that they were being targeted. Now, some of those hostile acts, actually, it's not about looking at the actor, it's about the behavior. And do we need to do a better job of catching that behavior quicker, stopping it? Yes. We are now doing that, and what we're seeing is the behavior change. So a year ago it was bots, now it's cyborgs. We're still seeing third-party services being used to deliver automated content in a way that we can't distinguish good content from legitimate content until after it's hit our service. So we're talking to the third-party companies. There's questions of, actually, where does the money go? There's a really interesting question to be done there around binary trading, which is actually a big revenue stream for some of these people. One of the other things I'm really interested in, it was something we heard earlier on, is around vaccines. Take a different issue, but how did bad information get into an incredibly important public issue around public health and vaccines? Actually, it was a British scientist who 10 years ago was discredited and somehow became a celebrity this side of the water and was able to build a movement. And one of the things that I'm still slightly concerned about is some of the response to this is more information. It's better communication. And one of the best quotes I heard, I was reading a book on the plane over by Matthew Dancona. I tweeted the last page of it. It's really, really good on the hashtag if you want to find it. But he used this phrase that the fight back needs an emotionally intelligent as well as rigorously rational approach. Truth needs an emotional delivery system. I worry right now we're kind of thinking that we can just put different information in front of people and that will solve it, because as we've heard, whether it's Brexit, whether it's Le Pen, whether it's Trump, whether it's in Germany, a lot of those people were voting for those things not because of information they saw. but of things that were happening in their lives. And I think it's very easy sometimes to compartmentalize bad results that we don't like as attributable to single factors, because that explains things. That's also what conspiracy theorists do. It's a simple explanation to a complicated problem. And actually, we have to be really honest here and say the problem is really, really complex.
So I think we could have substituted a whole bunch of people in the audience for this panel and had a perfectly great panel as well. So we do want to hear from you. So we got lots. So start with Mike, and then maybe somebody else raise your hand so we get the mic to the
Yeah,
second
I
person.
apologize for raising so quickly, but this is a great panel, lots of questions. I'll just ask two. So, Larry, you said something interesting that I've always wondered about, which is philosophically, the companies represented here and Facebook and others think about the First Amendment, and it's definitely embedded in their culture, and I know them well enough to know that. I've always wondered why. Why is it that, and I get this all the time on Twitter, I'm pretty active on Twitter, and I have my own rules about whether you get to be on my Twitter feed or not. You violate them, and I block you, right? And I always get a message, usually by email, a different venue, right? You're not protecting, my First Amendment rights are being violated because you blocked me, right? And I've always thought about that for the companies. Is there this idea that a private company, I think I know the answer, but I want to hear it, right? Is obligated to anybody to put up anything. I mean, the First Amendment does not guide you. You're a private company. And I've thought about, well, why is it? Well, maybe because there's not alternatives. Maybe there's not enough competition because you've become too big, and so you feel like you have to act like a utility. But help me explain that, because I've always, and it's back to your, I had to walk out one of our other guests, but it's the same thing of the editors. You know, you don't have a right to publish in the New York Times. Believe me, I know. They haven't published me many times.
Hundreds of columns sit in my computer proving it.
But then the flip side of that is, on the mice part from whose analogy? That was yours, Tim. The analogy of the mice part I've been thinking a lot about, which is I actually would like my Facebook feed to be better. I would like my Twitter feed to be better. I would like to be able to hire somebody, to pay somebody to do some editorial work for me. And the product does not, I've heard, I mean, there are tools you can use, Mike, I've heard it all. But if I think about other products I use and that I pay for, and that relationship between the consumer, and maybe therefore it's a consumer problem here. We're not demanding what we want from these products enough. Most people don't know about the relationship we have in terms of the information we give you for free. I remember when a very senior person at Facebook said, well, we just do things for free for you, Mike. We have to be better on the demand side for the things that we want in the feed. But maybe I want one that doesn't have all that crap in there. And you can go and set up an alternative, right? So could there be much more competition, and therefore the consumers would have more control over the information they get?
I mean, we are experimenting with things like that. So for example, on YouTube creators have a channel, and there's a comment space beneath every video. I'm sure you all are familiar with YouTube comments. And given the state of YouTube comments, we've launched various tools, including one that allows creators to check a box that says, hold potentially offensive comments for review. And it's basically a machine learning algorithm that is trained to detect content that is probably offensive to a general audience. It's
You're making me do it. What if I want to pay you to do it? Like me personally, I think you're better at it. Just go with me with the analogy for a minute, right? That you're putting all the burden on the consumer.
All you have to do is check a box.
I know.
And then none of those comments will show up.
But the point is, I want, just like I pay for the New York Times to have editor, I mean, all the 4 things you're talking about, what if I could pay you to do that for me instead of putting all the work on me to know all those different things? Would you take that business proposition?
But you can take it back and offer it as a service that YouTube should offer
I
for
did
people
put a
who
note,
want to.
new business model, pay to curate better feeds.
Let me push you on that, because your business model, we're not talking about free speech here, we're talking about business. RT is not.
No, but Mike, I think your answer is just in your question, which is if in fact there was huge demand for that, they would probably have done it. So I think there's not huge
Started a
demand.
couple of these, and the economics are punishing. and the demand doesn't seem to be there.
So
Yeah.
it's a perfect time for me.
No, I mean,
Perfect time for me to come in then. So we are doing this. We have a product called Moments, which is journalists picking content from Twitter, creating that content. It's response to breaking news, it's sports, it's the things that we think people are interested in. That's both in your timeline, but also a separate tab that you can look at. So we are absolutely looking at doing that. You may have also seen, kind of having things like news broadcasts, debate night in the Twitter app. So you can get straight to not just the wisdom of the crowd, but if you want to watch a Bloomberg broadcast, there's a Bloomberg show right there every night. So I think the big challenge, there is a business model challenge there. We're really excited about how Moments is going, but the wider question of what's the consumer expectation of what we get is a bigger conversation to have, because I think whether it's the way the Washington Post now works, whether it's the balance between paywalls, the access to information versus analysis is very, very difficult. And I think that is probably a whole other conference of how that works.
But to be clear, innovation is not done in this space, right? Like we spend a lot of time, because of the vast market power of these big platforms, talking about how they can get their houses in order. But it's absolutely the case that there's plenty of room for new businesses, new competitors, new models, new approaches to be spun up. And it's one of the things that, just like I said before, kills me, that people that, like in Europe, for example, that if the government spent half as much energy trying to figure out how to spark up the kind of innovative ecosystem that will allow new companies to be born there that they spend trying to regulate and tax American companies, it would be much better for them and for the world.
But just to come back to your first point around the First Amendment, I think there's also a simple explanation. One is First Amendment, like a handful of other constitutional values, due process being another obvious example, innocent till proven guilty, have seeped out of the legal system just into the general culture. That's one. And then two, Daphne's earlier point, which I thought you were going to jump in here to make again, is that these companies do have such power now that they are kind of quasi-governmental. I mean, they have virtual monopolies on a scale of the government. So I think those things contribute to and they're just using 20th century free speech norms. Timothy?
Timothy Garton-Ash. Much of what we've been talking about over the last 5 hours could be put simply as the difference between Facebook, Google, and Twitter as companies, and Facebook, Google, and Twitter as something else. And that something else is at least two things. It's things where we see you have a public responsibility. So defending the integrity of our electoral process, right? Or you supply a public good, news, political information by private means, okay? You manage a global public sphere. And things you yourself say. So we've had some very high-flown definition of missions here today. Justine said Facebook wants to bring the world closer together. How exactly we measure that? Google is going to organize the whole of the world's knowledge and make it available to humanity. Nick, please supply a missionary statement from Twitter.
I'll tweet it.
Yeah, come on. So here's the question. What is the place, structure, and process for scrutiny, feedback, and accountability for that second part? Because we know what it is for the first part. It's called the stock market. It's investors. Half the story I read about Facebook are on the business pages of the New York Times. What is the structure, process for that second part? Now, the only answer really that's been in the room so far is governments. And I'm not happy with that for two reasons. One, because I want to defend the First Amendment, since
I just want to modify.
it takes an Englishman to defend the First Amendment.
I don't think Germany's so bad.
But secondly, because governments are national and your platforms are international. So that whole question of the global public sphere, for example, Facebook's community standards. Okay, you comply with national legal requirements, but your Facebook's community standards are supposed to be global. So who else has to be part of that process? What about citizens and netizens? What about civil society? What about international organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's a multi-stakeholder process, and that's how we go about it. So we work with civil society and with governments and with academics and others to get input and expertise to define these guidelines. They're very dynamic. They have to respond to what's happening in the world, and as Nick said, to the way that behaviors change in terms of the kinds of content that people are sharing online. So Absolutely agree. I mean, I think that the decisions we make about where we draw the line on our content policies are important. And I think going back to your question, why do we care about free expression as a private company when we don't have to? The First Amendment doesn't apply to us. I think the concerns that everyone has about the power that these platforms have over individuals in society when looking through the lens of risk is exactly why we care about the First Amendment looking through the lens of benefit. So people who are using these platforms as political activists, as people who, we often say that YouTube has kind of democratized how stories and whose stories get told, and we still believe that that's net positive, that the value of that to millions of people around the world actually does outweigh some of the risks that we're grappling with today. And so that's why we care about free expression, because the power here is also quite positive in that direction.
And I think I can give you sort of a generic civil society answer about accountability and then overlay my answer. If you go to places like the Internet Governance Forum or RightsCon, the general answer is we need more transparency. The company's transparency reports are not broken down and fine-grained enough, or they don't include the removals that are under voluntary community guidelines. And that's one of the most important things that we need to know more about. I think that's absolutely true. My overlay, I would add, there are some other things that those transparency reports don't include, I think mostly because it's a nuisance, which is removals under like defamation law or hate speech law or blasphemy law around the world. Those, for the most part, are not accounted for in the company transparency reports. But the other thing I would add that's really important is something that Google does and Twitter does and a few other companies do is take the literal copy of a takedown request that they've received and send it to an organization currently housed at Harvard called lumen.org. They used to be called Chilling Effect. And then anybody on the internet can go look and see what was this request. They redact personal information, and if it's got the URL of child sex abuse material, they'll take that down, et cetera. But it creates this way for anybody to spot and correct an error. It's like the sort of open source mantra that with enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. With enough different people seeing what really actually specifically happened and what content got taken down, you can identify trends of errors, and there's great research doing that. You can identify individual outrageous examples like the Ecuadorian government using US copyright law to suppress videos of police brutality. So that kind of transparency, I think, is really important.
Over here.
Just to be clear, like that, none of that gives the public any sense of how the search algorithm works, how the newsfeed algorithm works.
Separate question.
Yeah, that's a whole, there's this whole, it's more subtle in its effects, but much more powerful, I think, than just the takedowns problem, is that problem. And I think it would be awesome if the companies would devote a lot of energy to trying to figure out how to run better, more open, more inclusive, more transparent, participatory processes around that. I remember being in the company, how irritating it was to have to contend with, sort of clearly unrepresentative but noisy, people who raise their hands to come and complain. And so, unlike a democracy, we don't have a voting electorate that we can turn to for validation or, to make decisions about these things. But there's got to be something in between, platitudes and full democracy.
Well, don't worry, there are whole conferences about that
We've
too.
got a question here. 10 minutes.
Thanks. My name is Andrew Bridges.
We'll try and answer quickly because we've got 10 minutes and we want to
We've been looking at these online platforms as important institutions, but I wonder how would this panel discussion have been different if the title had been Networks, Newspapers, Churches, Schools, and Universities, and Democratic Responsibility. I mean, I don't know if there's been empirical work, but I personally believe that Fox News had a bigger effect on the 2016 election than Facebook or RT. We have cable systems that allow people to get RT without a chyron at the bottom that says, caution, this may be state-sponsored propaganda. We have churches taking important positions that have been very influential on topics that may be very debatable in a democracy. But are we just singling out the digital platforms as the point of the spear without understanding all of the other cultural influences that are the wood behind the point of the spear in the attack on democracy?
Actually, I think I'll challenge that, which is, with the exception of Fox News, to the extent that all of those other sources are getting to mass audiences, it's through the platforms. It is increasingly through the platforms, even for Fox News, and look ahead 5 or 10 years. So they are the producers, but it's the distribution point that is, in fact, the source of our problem in terms of it reaching mass audiences.
Well, I would come back to that, because then let's go after AT&T and Verizon and the cable systems that are carrying some of these. Or maybe it should be Cisco and the likes. I mean, if you're talking about the vehicles for dissemination, those tend to be pretty neutral. These institutions we're talking about are institutions that are making choices, either choices they acknowledge that they have made by humans, or they deflect the responsibility to algorithms, which ultimately, somewhere along the line, were designed by humans.
Well, I mean, again, we want to get to other questions. I'll just say the point of analysis is simply this. There are producers and there's distribution. So the question is, and we have a problem as a result, right? And so if you want to sort of quibble with me about who are the distributors we should look at, do we want to go after the trucking companies that deliver the magazines to the newsstands or the equivalent of, I think we can have that conversation, but let's not just dismiss the problem, which is, as I say, the reaching mass audiences of kinds of materials that didn't used to, and the problem that poses for us in a democracy. So we've got a question there, and then get the mic over here, because this has had her hand up for a while.
Sure, I'll go for it.
Yeah, you go first.
Hi, my name is Dayar Turan, and I do AI research at CDDRL, and I was interested in a thought experiment. So we've been talking about how these platforms, or if they should curate, how can they curate? You know, we ask whether bots should have free speech, or if we can catch them ahead of time. Like, whose responsibility is it to catch fake news? So let's say we live in a dystopian society, right, where all the monopolies of social media are broken and everything is completely decentralized. Right, like there's no good way to enforce, incentivize, or fine entities or point fingers, right? There's no good way to control what people are ingesting. I'm curious, what kind of mechanics can we come up with that so that we can maintain proliferation of democratic ideals if fake news is here to stay? Like, what does democratic responsibility look like in the face of the rise of fake news, not fighting against it?
I think one of the problems with this conversation is that the world is very different than that. You have a few very big companies that do have enormous control, both on the content side and also on the advertising side. And so I think it's actually a luxury that we can point to 3 or 4 companies that if they do it right, then that'll be a model for the others that follow.
Hi, I'm Janine Zakaria. I was a longtime journalist for the Washington Post, Bloomberg, and others, and I teach journalism here at Stanford. With all the bashing of the mainstream media, I think one of the common themes of the day is that everybody's crying out for the gatekeeper again. They want to have that person making that kind of decision as a protective mechanism. And we live in this era of noise, and everybody's a publisher has a cost. Everybody's a publisher has turned your platforms into recruiting grounds for terrorists, publicity for jihadists. Friends of mine are harassed to death on Twitter. There's a lot of good things that these platforms do, but we have to acknowledge the costs. And you know what? I'm not waiting for the platforms anymore to make the right decision. Now that it's become a national security threat and a foreign country has hijacked our democracy, my question is, what's this going to look like? Is the FBI or the national security agencies going to subpoena the algorithms? Is it going to be legislation? Maybe nothing will happen under President Trump, but I almost feel like there's not going to be a choice in the matter for the companies anymore.
Well, I mean, you know, I think I said before, I think we're in a race against time. I hear your kind of frustration a lot, and you know, I think our role, the role I'm trying to play at NYU, we're doing a report for the World Economic Forum that Andrew and Eileen are part of. We're trying to urge the companies to step up and be much more, take an affirmative view, rather than be on the defensive. Oh, we've got a new problem, we're trying to deal with it. To say, this is a problem for our democracy. We know we're in the center of a very difficult debate. Here's our affirmative strategy for how to deal with it. There's still time for the companies to do it, but I think the time is running out.
Thomas Elvis. Just to sort of bring it down to like real life examples, we were criticizing before in the microphone. Mike? Roving Mike? Yes. Just to get back to, I mean, sort of the moment. We were criticizing before the Netzdurchgesetzung Gesetz in Germany, 50 million euro fines, $55 million for not taking down a story in 24 hours, and we all generally think it's a bad idea. On the other hand, last week there was a debunked story about a Seahawks football player burning an American flag. It was debunked, yet it's still up on Facebook. It has been shared 200,000 times since Monday, even though it was debunked last week. The question is, what is the answer to that? Is it that, and what happens if the player with this Photoshop photograph is attacked physically, or if the Seahawks attendance goes down? I mean, who do they sue? Well, that's the big question always in the United States. Who do you sue?
Let's finally get down to the nub of the thing. Who do we sue?
Right, but look, it's either going to be the government, and if it's not going to be the government, it's going to have to be, I mean, then there must be liability that a private individual can do it. And to say that, okay, we're going to, as I read, we're going to pass off judgment on whether a story is true or not to Wikipedia, which I don't understand how that's going to work. But, I mean, we're getting into epistemology when, in fact, we really are dealing with fairly crucial issues that are not epistemological, but rather can be, in fact, life-threatening. And in the case of other videos or things that have been posted elsewhere have been life-threatening, or have put people in jail, or so forth and so on. I mean, at some point, even with the First Amendment, you will have to deal with this issue because there will be something bad, really bad, that will happen.
So this is such a great note to end on, actually, because what you're capturing is what the broad Russian campaign is trying to do is just destabilize and weaken the United States. One of their tactics for that was to try to influence the election, but much more important, I think, at least at the moment, is their efforts to simply gin up division, right? So you see these Russian accounts. There was a really funny example where they, on Twitter, an account calling itself like Atlanta Antifa, they forgot to turn off their geo indicator, and so it was just, it was basically like a racist slur, but they said Vladivostok, right? And so comically, but so that's what they're trying to do. It's not about political ad accountability, transparency, which is a great thing. I hope it exists, but it's like one little sliver of what they're really trying to do, which is make Americans hate each other and to get into these echo chambers and to take advantage of the open platform algorithmic opportunities that they have to spread that stuff. And I think that Seahawks story is so perfect because the fact that it is still up and available on Facebook, still easy to find, and is not much more punishingly demoted or marked or labeled, that is, I think, a failure on Facebook.
And also, it originated in Macedonia.
Of course.
So I think we unfortunately need to bring our
Seahawks fans in Macedonia.
we need to bring our panel to a close here. We want to thank you all. We hope we've raised some questions that I think are worth continuing to think about. There's a lot of devices we never touched on that one might think about, and this conversation, I fear, will be going on for quite some time. Actually, I hope it'll be going on for quite some time, because I hope we're around to continue having it.